Sanders. I am in Measurement and Statistics in the College of Education. I'm an associate professor, and this is my student Nate, who is going to wave here. We have been working with Jessica and her wonderful team on the quantitative pieces of her project. And it's a very large project, and this is just one piece of it. So bear with us. We're going to get a little numbery, okay? Slide on. So just to recap what Jessica was sort of giving the large-scale overview. In year one, so that she showed year 0 where nobody was connected. That was sort of like the baseline. And what our analyses are going to focus on today will be the 4 years that we were there in the schools. And I don't say we, the team was there in the schools. Year 1 of the project was really the onset of the PD to really build the NIC network. And 50% of it at that time was funded by the district. Years 2 and 3, it was expanded in terms of frequency and duration of like studio days and data days. And there was some increased funding and participation by the district. And finally, by year 4, we're really into sustainability, where the UW researchers were going to take a step back and see that the network can sustain on its own without the researchers always being there. Even though they were important and central figures, we really wanted the district and the teachers to own their work. So that's just the overview, okay, of the 4 years that we're going to analyze here. And our research questions for this piece of the project was, what are the NIC network characteristics quantitatively? Are characteristics consistent or varied across time? I should say time, not Tim. What is the likelihood of a future connection in the network, and what might predict the likelihood of a future connection in the network? What's the likelihood of a new connection in the network, that it will persist, and maybe does anything predict that persistence? So those were our foundational research questions just for this piece of the puzzle here. But before we get started too much on results, social network analysis as a term gets used very loosely. You will hear it in all kinds of ways, and really there are 3 kinds to keep in mind. There's qualitative, where people go in and they do ethnographies at a particular school for a network of students, teachers, whatever the network might be. There's descriptive statistics, which are very frequent in educational research and social science research, where you're going to quantify network properties, like how dense is the network and things of that nature. And then there's model-based prediction, which is where the statisticians get called in. Okay? And where we're going to model, we're going to predict, actually, will a new network tie form given the network characteristics. And it's a complex model. But it's doable at a single time point, and more recently it's been expanded to multiple time points, and that's the one that we'll be looking at today. All right, so in order to get the network data, it's pretty data intensive, actually. You have to survey teachers or your network every single time point, and you have to allow them to nominate anybody in the network. We limited it to just 7 at a time. Most people panned out around 5. But 7 people could be nominated. The question was, have you interacted, collaborated with a colleague this school year, not necessarily at your school, who has influenced or helped you with your work as a science educator? And they could name up to 7. And then once they named a person, they got another question that said, how often did you interact with this individual around X, Y, and Z? And Jessica talked about the different kinds of instructional tools that you could interact around. And our focus for this particular piece was really around EL instruction versus other kinds of things that people could be focused around. Okay. Across years, there were actually up to 9 sites, because we include university as a site. We had researchers participating, and up to 105 participants. However, people come and go. You know this, right? Teachers come and go out of a school regularly. And so we limited our analysis to just those individuals who had participated for at least 2 years. We needed at least 2 years of data to model. Just as a side, we did check to make sure that each year, annually, the people that we left out weren't very different than the people we left in, just to allay that fear. So we have big stats around that, but we won't go down that road today. Network data was tabulated and analyzed in R using StatNet Suite and iGraph. And just a little network vocabulary. Jessica already mentioned some network vocabulary, but for example, we have this term called nodes, which are the individuals in the network. This is a hypothetical 7-person network. They could be called actors or individuals. I try to call them individuals, but of course, these kinds of analyses can be run on Facebook data and all kinds of things, as you well know, in the literacy. So, but in our world, it will be the participants in the network. Then there's ties, links, and edges, which I will call connections, because that's really what it's about. And ties, links, and edges can have different characteristics. You can have no arrow, so you see that you see arrows here, but you can have no arrow where they're just linked together with no particular direction. This is called a directional graph. But if there is an arrow, it means that person A is nominating person B. And then we have things called isolates, where you have someone in the network who didn't nominate anybody else in the network and wasn't nominated by anybody themselves. Okay? That does exist. And then finally, we have this idea of tie formation and persistence. Formation is when a tie actually connects. Persistence is if it connects over time. Okay. So there's some language there. All right, so our network descriptives, I have a whole table of numbers. But the basic summary of it is that the density was around 3 to 4%. Now that seems small, right? But this is out of all the possible connections that could be made. And there's 1,326 of those, 1,326. So that's not too bad. And what we actually found was teachers were really, if we look at any of the sociograms, this is a sociogram, if you look, these colors represent a given school. So people were making connections just in close proximity with others at their school. So that's why the overall density looks sparse. Within schools, it was robust. Relative efficiency was good, meaning that the distance from going from one person to another wasn't very long. People could get to another person, even if not directly, within like 2 or 3 jumps on average. And there was no strong likelihood of influential people, except at the beginning, you know, there was some district staff. You see the big purple, right? District people were in the schools regularly, not just at their own site. So they were influential, but the highest likelihood of somebody being popular was 6% in the network. That's not very high. So which means, in all, the information is really localized and traveling pretty efficiently. That's how we interpret this particular set of data. All right, so now for the probabilistic stuff. We used a model called separable temporal exponential random graph, also known as Sturgeon. We call it Sturgeon. It was developed by Kravitsky and Hancock based on some older models called ergons. And what it does is it predicts, yes, we have lots of fun acronyms. We predict tie formation across all time points. So it's not like a longitudinal model in terms like a growth model. It's not that kind of model. It's across all the time points, what's the likelihood of another tie forming in the future. Okay, so it's a little different than your normal kind of longitudinal models. We use predictors at the tie level, like whether it was around EL instruction or other kinds of instruction. Whether a tie was mutual, it's called reciprocity. We had participant role, participant site membership, and ties persistence after formation, plus all of those interactions. So those were the things that we put into the model. I have a picture of the model later in case you're interested. And here are the results. We found that the mean likelihood of a tie was only 4%, but this matches the density, right? The density was 3 to 4%. So the likelihood of another tie forming in the network was 4%. The likelihood a tie would be mutual, like reciprocal, was 17%. And that was significantly different from average. Okay? Oh, that's my timer saying you're out.
Sorry.
I'm almost done, I promise. Ties with non-teachers actually had a lower likelihood. This was really positive news. That means that the university researchers and the district staff were less likely to have a tie form with them. And that's what we want. We want the teachers to form ties with each other. So that was really wonderful news. Tie around EL instruction was actually significantly higher than other kinds of instruction. 7%. I know that doesn't seem like much, but compared to our 4% average, that's really good. That a tie will persist was actually 10%. So we had high persistence, which indicated sustainability of the network, also very important. And the predicting that a tie would persist is actually more likely if it's a mutual tie. So if the two people are individual together. And then finally, we saw a lot of site variation. So some sites only had a 1% likelihood of a new tie forming. Others had like a 6% at Lewitt. I think one of our panel members will be getting in deep at some of these schools. But we did have significant school variation. Okay, there it is. So big 3 idea takeaways. The AST NIC was sparse but efficient. The likelihood of a future connection was higher for teachers, for instruction centered around ELs, and that schools varied. And then 3, the likelihood of connection would persist was also significant, indicating evidence of sustainability. Those are the 3. Happy to take your questions later.